Welcome to the session on using high-quality instructional materials to accelerate learning in the post-COVID world. That sounds a little ominous, but we'll jump into that. My name is Melissa Lautenschlager. I'm the Director of Instructional Materials and Implementation at TEA, and I am joined here by Dana Moyer. Dana, if you want to just introduce yourself. Can't hear you. Oh, there you are. There you are.
Hi, I'm the Director of Content Implementation at the Texas Education Agency, and I work with our Texas home learning materials and professional learning across the state.
Great. So before we jump in, I know this is a small group this morning, but we're excited that you were able to join us. Please, if you have questions as we go, if you'll enter them in the chat or you have other things that you would like for us to mention, we can be somewhat flexible and share some more information. Okay, Dana, if you'll go to the next slide. So I want to start here. We are going to talk about high quality instructional materials and how they can be leveraged to support learning acceleration. However, I would be remiss to not mention that high quality instructional materials and assessments are part of a larger picture. For effective instruction that results in student growth and achievement, there are several components that tie into there. We are going to focus on the high quality instructional materials, but again, I want to stress that this is a place where in isolation is not going to support just teachers, but it is a key factor that supports effective instruction. So if you could move to the next slide. So high quality instructional materials can be a strong lever and you are already using or selecting materials of some sort to work with your students. And selecting high quality is not more expensive than selecting lower quality, and actually can really help to solidify what your schools look like and what's instructional models that you're using, consistent not only across a grade level, but vertically as well. And so it can be a key lever in supporting the work that you're doing. Before we jump into the accelerated learning portion, just talking at first, what are high quality instructional materials, and really understanding the components that solidify why they are high quality. So the top priority here is that we have our standards set by the state, our Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, and all materials that are high quality need to ensure full coverage. They also need to be aligned to evidence-based best practices that are relevant to the content area. And so ensuring that you're using materials that have research-backed best practices that are known and have been tried with students and teachers to ensure that they are effectively supporting the content area. They also need to support all learners. This includes students with disabilities, English learners, and students identified as gifted and talented. Although we are talking about Tier 1 instruction here, there should be a strong support of ways that the content is delivered in instruction that supports different modalities and also is providing guidance to teachers for differentiation for all learners. They also enable a frequent progress monitoring through embedded and aligned assessments. So having these strong assessments that are throughout the materials, such as things as exit tickets or short diagnostics or end of unit assessments, help to understand where students are and if they have sufficiently learned the information, the content and skills. And then lastly, high quality instructional materials include implementation supports for teachers. These are going to be teacher and student facing lesson level materials. Within that, they can be educative for teachers as well to truly understand the content and better support student growth because they know how students develop in their learning of content and skills. Next slide. So jumping in here a little bit, even before all of COVID happened, which some days feels like before was a very long time ago, there was some studies that were done, in particular the opportunity myth by TNTP. And what they uncovered is that when students are given the chance to do grade level work, they succeed more than half the time. So looking at the data here, what you're seeing is that we see success rates on grade level work were similar for students of color and white students, but 4 out of 10 classrooms with a majority of students of color never received a single grade level assignment. And so what you're looking at here is that we have students that are not even being exposed to the appropriate grade level and therefore aren't having the opportunity in some cases until they are going to an assessment to truly see grade level content and are able to work with that throughout the year. The other part I want to talk about here is that access to grade level work is even more critical when students begin substantially behind. So many times we think that if a student is behind in their understanding, by bringing the material back to that place, we're actually servicing students. And we're doing that with the best intentions in mind, but actually we know that if students are exposed and are interacting with grade level material, they're going to grow more. So if you look at the data here and you're looking at how many months of learning growth that you are seeing, if students are if they are being exposed to grade level material, and they are substantially behind, they actually are growing more. So if you look at the top versus the bottom, you're seeing that students just having the exposure to the grade level material is a big game changer for being able to grow in their development of content knowledge and skills. That research was done pre-COVID. We already know, and I think you probably have experienced firsthand in some cases, that students had places where they were not in the best situation, or there was just lots of struggles over the course of the year in which a normal growth was not really happening because of interruptions. So one of the things that we know is NWEA did a study, and they predicted that students will experience a learning loss of 50% in math. And so we've already started looking at the data statewide, and we're seeing significant decreases in math. And this is just a place where, yes, it's critical, and there are ways to address it in not going all the way back to a student's gaps and almost going back 1.5 years of learning, but actually to move forward. But we have to face the reality and then prepare for what is needed to support student growth this next year. So in the past, and probably many of you experience this, I know as a teacher, there would be times where we would spend almost the whole first 6 weeks going back and reteaching from the year behind, and that's in a typical year. And so historically, we've tried to address learning loss in 3 major ways. One, retention. Students that fall in far behind their peers are retained and have to repeat an academic year. That seems really hard to do in this current situation because it really isn't the fault of anyone here that students were not learning. And so we have to face reality and find better solutions. Another way that we address learning loss is through social promotion. So this typically is happening at the later area of elementary and middle school because students are progressing in their development. And so we move them even though they're not ready academically to move forward, which can be very challenging and need to set up significant structures to support students. And then the last is remediation. So at a basic level, remediation means teaching it again. And so that's where I was saying where you would almost teach a whole 6 weeks of the material students should have learned the year before. And we're going to talk about what happens with that. So due to COVID, students are likely to be further behind than ever. And I know all of you are considering that even as you might be starting a new school in some cases and really thinking for the future. So typical approaches to catching students up has not been proven to be effective. We don't need to remediate student learning. We really need to accelerate. This starts by keeping grade level content at the heart. So we can't go back and reteach a year and a half, or else we won't be able to expose students to the important grade level material. And we know that that is a huge piece of what actually pushes students forward. I want to take just a moment to take a look at this data. So we have to improve practice. Acceleration to grade occurs only 4% of students across all grades and subject areas. So what you're seeing here is that third graders that did not meet grade level in third grade, only 5% of those third graders were meeting their grade level reading, and they weren't able to catch up. Most of those students weren't able to catch up in 2 years. So if a student is significantly behind and they're behind in third grade, the chance of them catching up by fifth grade is really slim. And that's what the practices that we're doing. What we need to do is really need to accelerate, and students who are accelerating their learning are able to catch up by that fifth grade. So a practice that many of us are familiar with, and maybe even something you were considering, is how do we start the year with remediation? How do we take and preload all the information that students might have missed in the year and a half that we've had interrupted learning? This is a traditional way that we do that. We know that if we spend a good chunk of time somewhere, time has to come off at the end, and we're not able to actually reach all the content by the time we need at the end of the school year. This also assumes a lot of things about students. It's making an assumption that every student needs remediation of everything before they can jump into learning. That is not a practice that is going to be effective or move us forward as quickly as we need to in the next year. So we're going to talk more about this just-in-time intervention, and that's really taking an acceleration approach. The just-in-time intervention, if you can see on the bottom, is working through content that is important for what you are about to teach at the appropriate grade level. So if you look at the dark bar at the front, that is by identifying what students do have gaps with, working to do some in-time intervention and prepare them for that unit they're about to learn, the content and skills they're about to jump into. That's for everyone, that bar in the front. So we're going to jump in a little bit further here and talk about this just-in-time intervention. When we talk about just-in-time intervention, we're really talking about accelerated learning versus remediation. So remediation often focuses on drilling students with isolated skills that really don't connect to the learning that is about to happen. They connect to standards before, and it may be hard for students to understand, why am I learning this now, and how does this connect to what I'm about to talk about. And it doesn't create this cohesion where students are able to use the information quickly and then move forward in the appropriate grade level. Accelerated learning is really about strategically preparing students for success in current grade level content. Acceleration readies students for new learning. Past concepts and skills are being addressed purposefully in connection to the new learning. So how do we do this? Well, really looking at this just a little deeper into just-in-time intervention, this starts by identifying the lesson prerequisites. So understanding what do students need to come in with to be able to access the new material. Then it is using a pre-assessment to diagnose unfinished learning. So instead of assuming that students did not learn all the content that's prerequisite, it really is honing in on what specifically do you target during this time. And then map the pre-test and prerequisites for that just-in-time learning so that students are getting the appropriate learning from prerequisite content and skills right before they need to learn it for that grade level material. It helps to make a stronger connection for students and sticky so that they are able to retain that information and use moving forward. Additionally, you're ensuring daily and weekly schedules allow for this prerequisite to be taught just in time. So you may have to do some small adjustments in order to be able to do this just in time learning. And then you are planning lessons and independent study and activities so that students have the experiences they need that connect the prerequisites to the new learning. If you can look at the bar that doesn't go, the spans of the orangish bar, that really is identifying small groups that you might need to teach some additional or need some additional support. So not everybody may need this, but you're then building in opportunities for students to get the specialized supports they need to access the grade level content they are learning at that time in their core instruction. So how do high quality instructional materials help to do this? Well, one thing I want to mention is it is hard to do that work that we just talked about. It is very difficult to take a look, design the pre-assessments. There's a lot of steps that need to happen. Having really strong instructional materials help your teachers to do this work. So we're going to specifically talk about Texas Home Learning materials because they have specifically been designed to support in our high quality instructional materials. What they can allow and help support teachers with is teachers are spending less time building lessons from scratch and having to do all those complex pieces in a short amount of time. And now they can spend more time differentiating lessons and activities for individual students. So pulling in that truly just-in-time intervention specialized for students based on the data that you've collected. Instead of searching the internet for materials and activities, they're spending time analyzing and acting on student progress data. You have to give up something to be able to move to this next step of being able to really understand where your students are and flexibly adjust with your students. Additionally, modifying existing classroom materials for remote learning, they don't have to make those changes. Now, hopefully we're not going to have lots of remote learning, but you might want to customize different ways to support students. And so you might be having a way in which you're doing some unique teaching styles that are different and maybe think about ways that students can interact with the material that meet their needs individually. THL does provide, our Texas Home Learning products provide powerful supports for your COVID response. They provide strong tier 1 instruction. What we talked about at the beginning about what makes high quality instructional materials, all of them are being extensively reviewed and continuously improved to ensure that they do. Within the materials, there are embedded ways to address learning loss. So Dana's going to jump in and share some ways to address learning loss and how we accelerate learning. But within the materials themselves, there's guidance, there's prerequisite skills and knowledge, understanding, and there's ways to assess throughout. All products support both in-person and remote instruction. Again, we hope that all students are in the classroom, but we want to provide a flexibility that allows you to work within your schedule and maybe some new and innovative ways in which you are addressing learning for all students. And then using high quality instructional materials provides teachers with more time to do what matters most. Teachers will know their students and be able to respond to student needs, and spending less time on creating and finding those materials. For Texas Home Learning, if you aren't aware of this already, but we have 10 Texas Home Learning instructional materials so far. We have an integrated pre-K that's in English and Spanish. We have several math programs, including K-5 math and a 612 program, and supplemental, which is a digital program to help support as well. There's K-12 Reading Language Arts, which does include Spanish in K through 5. And so also we have a K-2 skills component alongside the other comprehension and knowledge building. And then we have K-5 Science. We are still developing and working through Spanish K-2 skills and social studies to come out next year. So I'm going to move it over to Dana, who's really going to jump deeper into learning acceleration, specifically in math materials.
Thanks, Melissa. So we did the high-level overview of why learning acceleration, why now, why high-quality instructional materials, and I'm going to go into a specific example for math. I want to name that. Again, I'm going to use the Texas Home Learning instructional materials as an example, but this approach for learning acceleration can be used with any strong instructional materials. It also can be used in other subjects like reading. But if you're really thinking, I'm interested in this learning acceleration approach, how do I actualize it? How do I operationalize it? That's the example that I'm going to go through for the rest of the time. So keys to accelerating learning through just-in-time intervention. So the first thing we have to think about is prioritizing the most critical prerequisite skills and knowledge for that upcoming unit. Again, we're not starting the year with a huge chunk of remediation. We're doing a small amount of just-in-time learning just for the upcoming unit. Need to diagnose students' unfinished learning on that prerequisite content using some strategic assessments. And again, I'll go into some instructional materials and how they could support you in doing that. Integrate those just-in-time lessons so that students can be successful in the grade level content and scope and sequence that's coming. As a leader, you need to make sure your schedule is adapted to ensure that all students have access to tier 1 instruction, but there's also some tier 2 and tier 3 intervention time to support students that need it. We've got to make sure we train teachers and leaders to plan and execute in this learning acceleration just-in-time intervention approach, and monitor student progress, as we always do, to adjust our approach as needed. So I'm just going to go through a couple of those steps and how, again, the Texas Home Learning materials, specifically Eureka Math TEKS Edition, which is our kindergarten through 5th grade materials, do a lot of this work for you and could help you implement this approach as an example. So first, prioritizing the most critical prerequisite skills and knowledge can be a really hard task. As a curriculum person, as someone who worked in math curriculum for years, that can be a time-consuming task that requires a lot of content knowledge. But in our Eureka Math instructional materials, they've already identified the foundational standards for each upcoming unit. So prior to starting a unit on measurement in second grade, you can see the first grade standards that students need and might be missing because of the disrupted learning that we've had. So this step is really supported by high quality instructional materials such as Eureka. We need to diagnose students' unfinished learning so that we're not assuming gaps are there when they're not. And we're really identifying what gaps are there that we do need to fill. And I want to really call out this pretty unique tool that our Texas Home Learning materials have. Our Eureka Math TEKS Edition materials come with an aligned tool that's available for the next year called Eureka Math Equip. Equip is pre-module assessments that focus on the essential pre-module or pre-unit knowledge necessary to tackle grade level content. So if you're looking for a quick assessment that tells you what students know from the previous grade level that they need to go into the immediately upcoming unit, Equip helps teachers identify that for their students. It's a pretty cool tool. So this tool has diagnostic questions, it produces reports, it tells teachers what the prerequisite skills that students are missing for the upcoming unit are, and it gives instructional recommendations. So if you're planning for those just-in-time lessons to help students access the upcoming Eureka Math unit, it tells teachers what content from the previous grade level that they should focus on in order to ensure that tier 1 grade level success. So I'm not going to go through 100% of the steps, but I did want to highlight a couple of differences. If you're using a high quality instructional material, like Texas Home Learning, not the only high quality instructional material, but one we have access to, or if teachers are planning for this just-in-time intervention approach. So learning acceleration with just-in-time intervention without high-quality instructional materials in place requires a lot of teacher planning and work on identifying the TEKS that need to be taught as prerequisite knowledge, on assessing, creating assessments that will identify those prerequisite skills, administering those assessments, adjusting the scope and sequence to prioritize just-in-time intervention. The work is still hard with high quality instructional materials, but many of the steps are different and provide a lot of teacher support in those materials. So if you have high quality materials, it's a matter of reviewing the scope and sequence, studying the unit, internalizing the unit, and activating those just-in-time intervention supports that are already guided through the materials. Couple of additional things to call out is just the level of time and effort and content knowledge and support required to create assessments aligned to prerequisite skills, administer them, and analyze data in order to do a true learning acceleration just-in-time intervention approach. Whereas with high quality instructional materials, we can administer the assessments that are provided with a tool such as Equip, which I previewed with our Eureka Math materials, and analyze the student work in the platform that's provided. And again, if we move on to having to create just-in-time lessons versus having to use the lessons that are recommended from the high-quality instructional materials. So again, this approach can be done with instructional materials, without high-quality instructional materials, with Texas Home Learning, without, but the tasks are very different, and the lift for teachers without high-quality instructional materials in a learning acceleration approach, especially when we know they are doing so much and working so hard, is quite large. So just kind of revisiting, I zoomed in on a couple of these steps and showed you what it would look like with and without instructional materials. But I want to just name these first 3 steps: prioritizing the most critical prerequisite skills and knowledge, diagnosing students' unfinished learning, and integrating just-in-time lessons can all really be accomplished by adopting high-quality instructional materials and following the guidance that those high-quality instructional materials provide teachers on how to follow a learning acceleration and just-in-time intervention approach. And of course, high-quality instructional materials allow for customization focused on your specific local context to make sure they're working for you and your students. So if we think about addressing unfinished learning, always something we needed to be thinking about, and that much more important this year. Instead of 9 weeks of remediation or some other structure at the beginning of the year that puts students in a cycle of below grade level work for an extended period of time, you could think about adopting high quality instructional materials and the aligned supports for your teachers and coaches to use them effectively. Then adapt your schedule to make sure there's time for all students to engage with those materials and have strategic intervention to be able to access grade level content. Make sure your training is around just-in-time intervention using those instructional materials, and monitor your student progress. So if you think about adapting your schedule, I'm sure you're thinking about schedules right now at this time of year, collecting and evaluating master schedules and beginning to plan or adjust the summer and fall instructional sequence to allow for a just-in-time intervention approach means we've got time built into the scope and sequence before each unit in order to provide below grade level instruction. And we've got some intervention time throughout the unit so that all students can access that tier 1 content. And I'm sure you're also thinking about your training for teachers and leaders to plan and execute just-in-time supports if you're following this approach. So you might want to think about piloting it. If you're working on if you have a summer program right now, you might want to think about it there. Plan to support students at all different levels, both in and out of tier 1 instruction. So again, this approach to learning acceleration assumes that all students can access grade level content when given the appropriate just-in-time intervention supports. And this could prevent students from having compounded and increased learning loss by continued access to below grade level materials. So again, this approach requires some adjustments to your materials, to your calendar, to your training, but can really help students accelerate their learning, in particular for this upcoming year. So that brings us to the conclusion. I really want to leave with the reflection of, as we prepare for this upcoming school year, how are you thinking about accelerating learning for our students? So that's probably one of, if not the biggest questions on all of our minds right now. But I can go ahead and pause and see both in the chat, or I believe you can come off mute, if there are any questions from anybody in the audience about learning acceleration, about Texas Home Learning materials, or anything else that you're thinking about related to instruction for the coming year. All right. Well, if there are no questions, I want to make sure you know if you're interested in the Texas Home Learning materials that you can visit texasHomeLearning.org and find more information about them there. I encourage you to think about this learning acceleration approach and wish you all the best as you're planning for this upcoming school year.
Thank you all.
Thank you.